Hello, my name is Vicky Jewell, a PhD researcher working out of the University of Warwick. Today I'm going to be talking about some aspects of colour on the Athenian Acropolis, and in particular on the Parthenon. When we think of ancient Greece, we tend to imagine grand white temples and elegant architecture that for one reason or another we usually think of as colourless. The truth, of course, was very different. The ancient world was no less colourful than ours. Without concrete adorning their cities, we might picture it more brightly painted than we are used to. In fact, in a society where literacy was considerably lower, visual competency in communication through colour was more crucial than it is today. As such, ancient society was at least as capable of supporting a wealth of colour meanings through their art and literature. But for many modern people viewing ancient coloured art, or talking about the significance of colour in the ancient world, there is an existing predilection to view colour as a strange or improper addition to ancient life. The contemporary view that colour is something crude and lacking elegance perhaps reached a peak in the work of Le Corbusier in the early 20th century, who wrote that colour was only suited to simple races, peasants and savages in response to his travels to the East. In a particularly strong expression of opinion, Julia Kristeva stated that the chromatic experience constitutes a menace to the self. Colour is a shattering of unity. Colour is also accused of being the realm only of children. Adults tend to opt for subtler tones, whereas a child's toy will almost always be brightly coloured, rendering strong hues infantile and vulgar to anyone beyond a certain age. Thankfully, in the last century, these ideas have begun to shift. Beginning perhaps with the advent of modernism, artists like Matisse and Picasso moved away from realism to introduce a new way of reading art. Colour became increasingly significant, famously so in the work of post-war artist Yves Klein, who invented a new shade of blue and proceeded to present his audience with paintings consisting solely of raw ultramarine. As such, bright hues are now acceptable to modern life, but there is still an uneasiness around ancient colour. Today, classical history is increasingly popular, reaching an ever-widening audience. We are entirely comfortable with the bright friezes of Egyptian tombs or Roman mosaics due to the steady exposure of the public to those kinds of art over the centuries since their respective discoveries. Yet, on the ancient Greek statues that have traditionally been viewed and used as a benchmark for sophistication, even that word itself follows suit and adopts a Greek linguistic root. Colour is still confusing and somehow jarring for many people. As such, our own history of the reception of ancient colour has affected how we tend to react to it now. It's with this social baggage that we view restorations of fully polychrome classical art with mixed emotions. The buildings of the Acropolis were the most extravagant expression of Athenian wealth and power in ancient Athens, and colour would have been everywhere. But what colours were they? Next, the challenge is to recover lost colour. One technique is to take tiny samples from the surface of the sculpture, but this usually relies on us being able to see that there might have been something on the surface in order to justify the test, as after all it is invasive and the statues are incredibly precious. We can also X-ray the statues to make the shapes of very faint colour stand out so that we're more able to interpret them. These are the techniques used by Vincent Brinkman's Reconstruction work, with which his team have created life-size casts painted in the way that those of the ancient world might have been, which then form part of the Gods in Colour exhibition, like here for Core 675. Not only is this work important so that we might better imagine how the ancient world might have looked, but sometimes it can change our interpretation of statues that we think we know well. The Peplos Kore, for example, is another that has been studied as part of the Gods in Colour exhibition. Again, we can see that there is some surface decoration remaining, but in her reconstruction, there are two here because there's a debate whether the main robe was yellow or not, it suggests that she may not have been a representation of a deceased maiden leaving an offering like most Kore, but actually a representation of the goddess Artemis. Both of these sculptures, the Peplos Kore and Core 675, was set up on the Acropolis to the east of the Parthenon, but it's worth noting also that Artemis was worshipped on the Acropolis too, in the Brauronia complex, which was situated between the Parthenon and the Propylaea. More complex scientific techniques have also been developed which detect microscopic remains of ancient paint and recreate for us lost colour. The latest uses spectroscopy to interact with molecules of paint remains. In this field, one foremost academic is Giovanni Verri, working out of the British Museum and primarily focusing on the Parthenon marbles, and who as recently as 2018 was able to stun a room full of experts in the study of ancient colour by revealing the painted frieze of decoration on the folded robe of Diane, which is invisible to the naked eye. Diane is one of the goddesses carved on the eastern pediment of the Parthenon, where the subject matter is the birth of Athena. She rests in the corner of the pediment with her daughter Aphrodite and was clearly heavily painted. Instead of being plain white or even a plain painted colour, her robe would have looked more like that of Hebe from the Sophilos Dinos, with painted friezes of decoration. It was not just the pediments that were painted on the Parthenon. Work has been underway for the last few years to stabilise and restore the structure, and while the scaffolding has probably ruined a lot of holiday photos, it has also presented an opportunity. It has been possible for archaeologists to get much more up close and personal with the building, and while they've been there, they've found traces of still bright paint in well-protected corners of the entablature and the architectural structures, as well as on the sculpture. On the frieze, most of which is now in the British Museum, colour would have been particularly useful. It was carved up in the eaves and the second set of columns under the roof, and scholars studying the carvings have wondered in the past how much of it you would have been able to see. However, one benefit of the bright paint would have been how much more visible the detail would have been, especially as it would have stood out against a deep blue painted background. The frieze itself shows a religious procession, with the Athenian cavalry galloping down each of the long sides and the parade of people at the west and east. In the middle of the eastern frieze of the Parthenon, above the door, is the culmination of the Panathenaic procession, and here we find another important example of colour. The festival of the Panathenaea was a celebration of Athena's patronage of Athens. Every 4 years there would be a great Panathenaea, and during that festival there would be competitions similar to the Olympics. But the religious part of the festival was celebrated every year and finished with a procession through the city of Athens that ended up at the temple. There, sacrifices were made and a big feast held, but most importantly, the new robe, the cult statue of Athena, was brought into the temple to decorate her. The Athena Parthenos, literally meaning Athena the Virgin or Maiden, was a colossal statue of about 11.5 meters tall, standing on a base that was 4 by 8 meters. She was carved by Phidias, the master carver, who was the architect for the project that built the rest of the Parthenon. He was also the creator of the statue of Zeus at Olympia, known as one of the wonders of the ancient world. She was chryselephantine, meaning that she was inlaid with ivory and gold, with gemstones for her eyes. All of this must have glittered in the light of the inside of the Parthenon and reflected from the pool of water that was set into the floor at her feet. She was also lightly painted, although sadly none of the statue survives today, but we do have a good idea of her pose and the way that she looks from ancient accounts and Athenian currency, which featured the statue in much the same way that we find the figure of Britannia on our 50p pieces. The weaving of her robe began a year in advance, when 2 young girls, known as the Erephoroi, were taken to work at the Erechtheion. The Erechtheion was the structure to the north of the Parthenon, beyond the ruins of the old temple of Athena, which had been burned to the ground in the sacking of Athens by the Persians, after Xerxes won at the Battle of Thermopylae. It was this common enemy whom the Delian League banded together to face, and were first simply headed by Athens. However, this became less of an effort to work together against the Persians, and after the Athenians moved the treasury from Delos to the newly built Parthenon on the Acropolis, the League became tributaries to Athens. Tensions from this new empire eventually resulted in the Peloponnesian War, which Athens would lose, and with it, their ascendancy. But during the heyday of classical Athens, it was here that the two Arephoroi would help to weave the robe for Athena for the next Panathenea. Evidence of this comes from the plays of Aristophanes' Lysistrata and Euripides' Hecuba. These would have been originally performed as part of the Panathenea in the Theatre of Dionysus at the base of the Acropolis itself. They tell us about the rites that young women could have been part of. As soon as I turned 7, I was an Arephoros, and then when I was 10, a grinder for the foundress, and shedding my saffron robe, I was a bear at the Brauronia, and once, when I was a fair girl, I carried the basket, wearing a necklace of dried figs. Euripides' Hecuba describes the robe of Athena itself. Perhaps I shall come to live in Athena's city, and there, on the saffron peplos robe of Pallas, weaving bright threads in a flowery pattern, yoke the horses to her glorious chariot, or depict the race of raging titans, quelled by Zeus, son of Kronos, with the flame of his lightning. This tells us that the Arephoroi could be as young as 7, and that they would weave the robe for Athena from a cloth dyed with saffron, or krokos, which is a yellow pigment that we still use today, though mainly in our food. Saffron was developed from the wild crocus plant over 1,000 years before the classical period, on Crete by the Minoan civilization, and there are even Minoan painted frescoes which show them picking the crocus flowers. Minoans would only have been known to the Athenians through myth, specifically that of Theseus and the Minotaur, where Theseus sailed to the labyrinth at Knossos to defeat the Minotaur. For the ancient Athenians, as it was for the Minoans before them, the yellow colour that saffron-dyed clothing gave was associated with maidenhood. It was the colour worn by girls at their coming-of-age festivals, one of which was the Brauronia mentioned by the play, and either held on the Acropolis or at another site called Brauron in the Attic countryside. It is also the colour of their wedding dresses, as they left maidenhood and became a wife. Saffron dye was also incredibly expensive, as it was harvested by hand from the stamens of individual flowers. It therefore represented a considerable investment to use it, and to weave a robe the size of this statue of Athena Parthenos every year, it was another expression of the wealth and luxury that Athens could wield during this period. And so, at the end of the year, the Arephoroi left the Erechtheion and their beautifully woven yellow robe, and it was given to the procession of the Panathenea, which then took it all through the city until they returned to the Acropolis and brought it to the Parthenon, where the previous year's robe would be replaced with new finery. Above the threshold of that door is the painted frieze. On either side, the gods are arranged seated and enthroned. In the centre are a collection of 5 figures, 2 adults and 3 children, 2 of which are female and we might label as the Arephoroi themselves. The group are shown folding or perhaps unfolding a piece of cloth. This then is our krokos saffron robe, and would have been painted a bright golden yellow, a vivid and beautiful reminder all year round of the festival and celebration of their patroness, the eternal maiden goddess, Athena. Thank you very much for listening.